Thanks very much, Patia. And I am very, very pleased to have these three speakers today, because they are from three global media organizations, complex media organizations that operate internationally across a whole range of news and features and platforms and devices. And AI is integral to what they do. So next hour, we're going to hear from them about what they're doing, why they're doing it, what impact it has on their journalism. And of course, please put your questions to them, and we'll try and get a conversation going around it. But they are three fascinating people. I want to get them, first of all, just to explain what their role is in those news organizations, you know, what they do. And I'm going to start Lisa Gibbs from AP. Lisa.
So my title is Director of News Partnerships, which means that I work with a variety of news outlets and foundations and startups that manage projects with other organizations and the AP newsroom. I was AP's business editor 6 years ago now when we began automating the creation of corporate earnings stories. And that was really AP's first foray into this entire world, and our recognition that machine learning and automation and all these technologies could be, you know, and should be a really strategic part of our news operation from start to finish. And so I work now representing the newsroom to an AP-wide working group that includes representatives from technology and product and, you know, all across the company to identify and figure out ways that we can leverage these technologies further.
You know, really interesting, and obviously a kind of role that didn't exist a few years ago. Cait from the FT, I think your job title as well didn't exist a few years ago either. So please explain, what do you do?
I don't think it really exists at all, apart from for me. So my title is Chief Product and Information Officer at the FT, which basically means I run technology for the Financial Times. So I have a team of 450 engineers, product managers, business analysts, designers, project managers who work for me around the world in the UK, Bulgaria, and in the Philippines. And our job is to make sure that we build the right products and services to drive the FT's digital growth now and in the future. My slightly bonkers Star Wars-esque job title of CPIO is supposed to represent that I look after both product and technology. Now, in technology organizations, that's completely common, but in legacy organizations, you quite often have product and tech in separate organizations. And I think from what Lisa said, that might be the case at AP. So I look after all of product and tech, which means we have a single responsibility for making sure that we are doing the right thing. I'm on the board of the FT, which is really, really important, because as the FT increasingly becomes, well, it is a digital first company, and as the newspaper slowly declines, will eventually become a digital only company. So it's really, really important that the FT has technology properly represented within the company.
That's really interesting. And Emma from Bloomberg, obviously Bloomberg is you know, working with information at scale and incredible pace. What's your, you have got a very complicated job title, but you said I should call you Chief of Staff for simplicity. Explain, please.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm responsible for operations, for ensuring that we're staying on track, on target with the goals that we've had, that we've made for the year. But more broadly, the sort of the chief of staff umbrella is an easier way to describe it, because it's my job to advise on strategy and really work with the heads of each of the departments across the newsroom to make sure that we're aligned and executing on the same priorities in complementary ways. And so part of that is looking at what we're doing with technology across the newsroom and really making sure that it underpins everything that we do, from all parts of the journalistic life cycle, which, you know, as we all know, is news gathering, news production, news distribution, but also workflow. And so what are we seeing? And certainly what the Journalism AI initiative is showing is that there's a huge opportunity for newsrooms, especially our newsroom, to embrace new technologies to touch each of these elements and really make sure that we have our arms around it more strategically as a company rather than in silos.
Yeah, and the strategy word is really interesting. When we did our report, we asked these 70 newsrooms, did they have an AI strategy? And I think I'm right in saying that 2/3 said no, they hadn't. And quite a few of them said, well, we don't actually have a strategy for anything. Can I ask you, Emma, what's your background? Did you come from the tech side or the journalism side? Or?
Sure. Yeah, I started as a news producer in cable news. So I got my editorial chops from covering the 2008 election from a cable news production standpoint. So figuring out how to pull all the different pieces together in order to create an on-air package, right? So I came into this industry with that in mind and thinking 360. And I ultimately moved over to the communications side of the world and sort of insisted that I sit in newsrooms so that I could use my editorial judgment to help elevate the stories and tell what we're, talk about what we're doing in the industry and how I was at the Atlantic Media at the time, talk about how they're fitting into the changing and evolving industry. And obviously the Atlantic at the time was going through a digital revolution very successfully. And so it was really interesting to be sort of front and center for that. And then ultimately I ended up at Bloomberg a couple of years in the communications arm, but came to this chief of staff role 4 or 5 years ago to really get myself back into it and pull the strands of everything I've learned from editorial to technology to the industry themes to figure out how we're all going to make sure that we're rowing together. So as technology has evolved and as that's become a much bigger priority for the industry at large, putting pieces of that into what we do every day is part of what I think is really exciting about my role.
Yeah, so we're already getting this sense of the three of you with perhaps different backgrounds, different approaches, but the one thing you've all got in common is that you work for organizations where this set of technologies, at least, seem to be terribly important, and with all three of you for some time. This hasn't just happened yesterday. So I wonder if you could just explain to me, when you say it's integral, to what extent is it now part of the operations for your organizations? Lisa, if you want to sort of kick us off.
Well, I mean, there's, thoughts are flying around my head here. And I'm really struck by what Cait said about how her job is structured, because she's absolutely right. I think that a lot of news organizations don't still have that merging of technology and product in the way that probably they should. And as you all were talking, I was thinking about, we even at the Associated Press still are addressing constantly, how do we take technology innovation, or AI as we're talking about here, from a very project driven, kind of approach, like, we have a need in our video production area. We discover a cool startup and we work on creating a tool that helps us. And then we move on to the next project somewhere else and the next project somewhere else. And how do we elevate that to build more innovation capability across the broader organization? And it's something we are still working on, even 6 years later. I'm kind of rambling and answer your question, Charlie, as usual, but there's just so many threads of this. We actually had an AI day at AP last year, a concept we stole from Dow Jones, which also had an annual AI day. And, that was really where we had the leaders of different projects around AP do presentations. We brought in other news organizations, and that was really all about trying to make sure that everybody at AP understood, what AI and machine learning is, how it's being used in the industry. Those ideas and innovations have to come from the field, or they're not going to be as effective in solving our problems.
But give me a sense of what's the impact? Is it just on, certain sort of very basic functions? Is it still just a few discrete tools? I know it's impossible to put a percentage on it, but how dependent is AP now upon these technologies, do you think?
Yeah, I would say for us, and you and I have talked about kind of the famous, news gathering, news production, news distribution construct, and what are the problems you need to solve within that. So I would say for us at AP, because we're an agency that's producing such a high volume of content across multiple formats, unlike other organizations you've heard from where using these technologies around customer loyalty and subscriptions and things of that nature are critical to driving revenue, for us, production efficiencies is really kind of the North Star-ish here, that we really find that we're working for. And I would say that when you look at the things we've done around, automated transcription, automatic creation of shot lists from videos, to be able to, handle faster edits, summarization tools that quickly take one story and create multiple versions of the same story. I mean, really all of those are very much geared toward that production, aspect of it, produce content more efficiently and produce higher volume of content to serve multiple platforms and audiences. And when I think about it, I think we are incredibly, sometimes we lose sight of this, but we are incredibly now dependent on it, and we have been much more it's much more an integral part of our thinking around these things that we're looking at. That the other areas we are not as far along as I think we should be on it. So that's where we are.
Cait, I remember, I can't remember how many years ago it was, when Lionel Barber actually gave a speech at my think tank POLIS at the LSD, where he announced the digital first bit. I can't remember how many, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And I wonder what sort of stage you think you're at now, if there is a sort of evolutionary staircase, if you like. You just mentioned that 400 odd people in various guises in your sort of area. What kind of stage are you at in terms of the FT, in terms of relying on it? That you have such a complex range of products, don't you? Including, of course, subscriptions, the user end.
Yeah, so I think the question is, are we digital first? Yes, absolutely, we are digital first. We still have a newspaper, and it's phenomenally successful. Its circulation has been challenged this year, like it has been with lots of other newspapers, because of COVID, particularly flight markets have been quite challenging for us. On the AI and machine learning front, I wouldn't say that we are completely dependent on it, and I would say, to be honest, we're somewhat in the shallows. Now, there are 3 main areas where AI in the newsroom is interesting. One is in production, as Lisa says, and where we've used it in production is in things particularly around gender bias and thinking about a representation of women within the FT content. So we experimented with a feature called Janet Bot, which was named after the chair of the Federal Reserve, who was one of the few women who used to appear on the front pages of the FT on a regular basis. And what Janet Bot used to do was to nudge news editors via Slack when it spotted that the percentage of women represented on the homepage of the FT had dropped below a certain level. And it didn't automatically then stick a whole load of women on the homepage. What it did was nudge the editors to think, have you thought creatively about your mix of stories? Have you thought creatively about what photos you can use? We have actually retired that recently. One, to have a bit of a rethink, but also, as is the case with lots of AI, it struggled with people from an ethnic background that wasn't white, basically. It struggled to determine gender when it was looking at photographs of Black women, for example, which is obviously very, very far from ideal. We've also used it to look at the percentage of people quoted from different genders within the FT. So how many? It's called He Said, She Said, and it looks at the percentage of men quoted versus the percentage of women quoted, obviously, and that's in collaboration with the BBC. We're looking at making sure that there are women's voices within the FT as well. So on the production side, that's kind of where it is. Then Lisa also talked about summarization summarization. Summarization is interesting. I think, in very, very structured stories, it's straightforward. So if you're thinking about earnings reports, as Lisa says, AP is doing that. I see someone from Nikkei this afternoon, and they've done phenomenally well in automatically generating very, very structured reports. You see that in sports journalism. Obviously, that's not a thing for the FT, but in sports journalism, being able to recreate a report of a match based on where the ball has gone and who's touched the ball is relatively straightforward. And something that we've been looking at is coronavirus reporting as well. So coronavirus reporting, when it comes to deaths, cases, hospitalizations over time by country, that's also very, very structured data that you could then create content out of. And then the third area, again, as Lisa referred to, is in terms of customer acquisition. So how can we use machine learning to make sure that we are offering the right person the right offer at the right time, depending on how engaged they are with the FT content. And that's, that again is incredibly fruitful. That's not in the newsroom, but it's essential to the business of making money from news. I think where we have stepped away from is in things like automatically ordered pages, for example. So we have millions and probably millions of indices within the FT, and the homepage is very, very carefully curated, as is the world page in the UK, and the company's page and the business page. But the coronavirus page or the US election page is just ordered by date. We've experimented with getting machine learning to order the stories for us based on what it's learned from how we order stories, and it was highly successful, and when you looked at it, it tended to make sense. The problem is with a lot of machine learning, particularly machine learning that you're buying in from outsiders, is quite literally a black box. So you don't know how the machine has made that decision, and if you don't know how that machine has made that decision, how do you make sure that that those decisions are the ones that you would be happy with? Because when people buy FT subscriptions, they're not just buying access to the content, they're buying access to the FT's view on what is important. And so in an era in which trust is being eroded on a daily basis by populist governments and other forces, understanding the FT view and having trust in the FT view, not just in what we write, but in how we present that content, is something that you do not give away, ever. And so that's also a really, really important factor when you're thinking about machine learning in the newsroom.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Cait. And so many of the sort of problems or challenges or opportunities you mentioned there are being tackled by the CoLab teams who are going to be doing their presentations and publishing their work. Mattia mentioned the AI Joe team that looked at biases. They mentioned many of the things you said. And it is a really interesting point, isn't it, Emma, that if you think about how much Bloomberg have already done, certainly with things like company reports and so on, it wasn't low-hanging fruit. I'm sure it was quite tough to do. But Bloomberg's also more complex than people think as a media organization. I just wonder where you think this goes now. As Cait said, it's not easy, but I just wonder sort of strategically where you think this goes for Bloomberg as a company.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've got a couple of different things that we can look forward to. I mean, one, we have been pretty good at automating a lot of financial news and a lot of market information. And I think the next phase of that is taking some of that automated content and figuring out if, bringing it back into the newsroom workflow and figuring out where we can really start to discover trends, which can help the journalists then ask questions about, hey, okay, here's a series of automated stories are leading us to sort of think twice about what might be happening in the market here, or what a company might be doing, and allow us to sort of, if as we integrate that, the work that we've already done with these automated stories and these market trigger stories, allow us to break news faster, or use our editorial judgment or our journalistic integrity to say, hey, this is kind of interesting, like this series of events. So the sort of the second phase of what we've done is figuring out, in one way, is taking the work that we've done and then doubling down on it, bringing it back into the newsroom workflow, and figuring out, what's there? Is there something there? Could there be something there? sometimes a lot of the times the answer might be no. But we've done the work, so let's reinvest. And then the second thing that I would say is identifying areas where we can bring more people into the fold, because I think that's really important as we're talking about, our strategy about this stuff is you can have a small group of people who are working incredibly hard to build these automated stories, to use this technology. But unless we really help with training and help to really get the rest of the newsroom to embrace this kind of opaque technology, AI, what does it mean? The more training we can do and the more communication that we have around the impact of this stuff can really help get more people, bring more people into the fold. We might have a reporter in Manila who wants to tell a story about something, but doesn't really know where to start. Well, we want to give them the tools, or at least the person to ask, and train our senior level managers and our editors with some of the skills and some of the abilities to say, okay, here's where you want to go. I mean, you might want to start with a bot that scrapes the website that you're looking for, or, oh, here's a script that we actually use for a lot of other similar things, and really expanding that throughout the newsroom so that we can dispel a little bit of the fear, and really leverage a lot of the stuff, the work that we've already done.
Really interesting. Lisa, if you're thinking about kind of, what you're doing now and what you're doing next, I mean, it's interesting that Emma has mentioned there the kind of people issue, if you like, or the knowledge issue. Cait also, though, mentioned that there are limits to these technologies. I wonder where you see the sort of balance. What do you think there's still, green grass ahead for you for AP, and what gets you there? Is it having more people who buy into this and know about this? Or is it the tech itself? Are you hitting walls where these black boxes, etc., aren't suitable or implementable in news organizations?
I mean, a couple of things. I mean, there have been, I think there's this balance between not wanting to kind of over dramatize, the AI is, going to change our world, and it's, or kill our jobs, or, I mean, there's kind of these trite narratives that, are very easy to fall into. I mean, just as a foundational thing, we all know that, innovations have been changing news, and the world, forever. And there's always been issues around adoption. Changing the way we do things is always challenging, whether it's a new workflow or a new technology, or, so having the right procedures and culture to be able to manage that is critical. So yes to training and yes to all of that. There's a separate issue we could talk about the lack of the real need for the news industry to develop the skills around data, technology, being able to work across those teams. We need more of that kind of skill overall.
Is that a question of having more data scientists or more programmers, or do you mean more, I know it's a false dichotomy, but is it more journalists who know a bit about that?
I think that. I think we all, we don't have close to 450 engineers or anything like that. So I would definitely put in a bid for more, data scientists and engineers. But I think the larger issue is that we need more the everyday beat reporter and producer and editor who have more literacy around that. But it also gets to another thing that we talk about a lot, which is a lot of times it isn't a technology problem or a willingness problem, it's a bandwidth problem. Or, and I think one of the things we've seen this year is a great example. I mean, I'm sure we can all talk about projects that were deferred, delayed, eliminated, that maybe fell into that category of, innovation that's not quite core. When times are tough, everybody kind of goes back to the core. And certainly my own newsroom, like everyone else's newsroom, covering the pandemic, covering racial injustice, covering, for us, a US election, like, hey, all hands are on deck for that, you know, and those really cool projects you had lined up to get done, well, that's going to be 2021 now, everyone, sorry, you know. So, and I think that, you know, resolving those issues, you know, is going to be important. But to the other point, and I'll stop talking in a second, I mean, yes, there are limits. And I think one of the issues here is that we always talk about is whenever you attempt a new project with, you know, these technologies, whether it's summarization or, you know, using an algorithm in some different way, like the first result is always terrible, right? I mean, like it's, and oh my God, like this is a failure. Like, even though like it isn't, like that's just part of the process. But, you know, so that work that has to be done and constantly retraining the machine or, you know, pivoting what you're doing, you know, that it can be frustrating, and it can end up, you know, killing things that really you should be pursuing with. But yes, there also has to be a recognition that, you know, this is not, we've still got a long way to go, and the technology isn't there yet to be able to solve all of our problems.
We're going to take some questions in a second, but first I wanted to ask you, Cait, I've now got this image in my head of 400 tech people in a warehouse in Bulgaria, I think it is, who are kind of beavering away, slaving away, creating new tools and products and things, which I'm sure is false. I just wondered, you know, you have got good resource, but how much you've had to change. I mean, the FT, as well as you personally, have had to change the way you work, perhaps with outside experts or outside companies, or differently within the organization to sort of to be able to provide the relevant tools. Because as Lisa said, you know, media organizations are not terribly patient. They don't see themselves as tech laboratories as such, do they?
Yeah, so they're not in a massive shed, they're all at home, like we all are. And there's about a couple of hundred people in London, about 100 in Bulgaria, and elsewhere in the world. But we are all at home, apart from a few people who are going into the office for the sake of some human company, mostly. So I think I think the really important thing is, what is the outcome that you are looking for? And we are incredibly outcome driven at the Financial Times. And so we don't start from here's a technology, or here's a thing, or here, and Lisa mentioned projects. Projects make me feel slightly anxious, because projects deliver whatever it was that the project decided that it was going to do. And that's neither here nor there. What matters is, what is the outcome that you are trying to shift? And the totemic metric that we care about at the Financial Times, because we are a subscription business, is lifetime value. So, you know, everything that we do, whether that is driving engagement, i.e. getting people to use our products and services more often, or acquiring them more often, acquiring them more efficiently, or internal tools that allow us to manage our subscription base more efficiently, or create journalism, is all designed to improve lifetime value. And so the point is we have a relatively sophisticated process of working out, you know, what are the opportunities. So given that we want to, for example, drive engagement to therefore drive lifetime value, when we're looking at things like AI or a technology, it's much, much more about what is the outcome that is going to drive, and how can we assess whether this particular technology or this project is more likely to increase lifetime value than something else. And you know, we have sophisticated data science capability within the FT in order to help us make those decisions and guide those decisions, and also use modern product development processes to test our hypothesis. So, you know, if our hypothesis is that we can drive engagement by having better organized indices, for example, we would be looking at that versus what we could do on the homepage to make it more personalized. And so the key is really laser-like focus on the outcome you're trying to deliver, and being able to, at a very high level, to be able to judge whether one opportunity has got more promise than another to drive that outcome that you care about, and then using data science and also testing and talking to audiences to validate those hypotheses, to reduce the risk of what you're doing as quickly as possible, and then keep going after that number. So don't just launch it and leave it, or as they say in the MOD, was a phrase I learned the other day, build and rust. A lot of organizations build and rust, and it's a terrible idea. It won't get you where you want to get to. The point is to have durable teams who are going after an outcome, testing and iterating really quickly using good product discovery processes, and then keeping going. The technology that you use, whether that is artificial intelligence, machine learning, or anything else, is part of that process. What you don't start with is, I've got this machine learning technology. We need to have AI in the newsroom, and from that direction, because if you're not really focused on the outcome, you won't be successful.
Yeah, brilliant advice. Mattia, you're going to bring out some questions for us. I can see you've got loads of questions here.
Indeed, we are receiving loads of questions. The conversation is really inspiring the curiosity of people both on Telegram and on YouTube. So thanks to everybody who has been putting up questions already. It's hard to decide where to start, so I went for Telegram and for a rather general question that you can share your experience on. Lynn is asking, what are your top tips on things newsrooms should avoid when introducing AI into their workflows? Looking back on your past projects, what could have saved you some heartache and pain? I thought headache, but she actually meant heartache and pain.
Yeah, those are great ones. It's not quite what mistakes have you made, that dreadful job interview question, is it? But it's kind of which sort of blind ends do people traditionally go down? And Cait's kind of mentioned one, which is when you perhaps over-obsessed about the technology. Do you want to start there, Emma? What do you think the things to avoid are when you're trying to, implement, or even just to think about implementing AI-related solutions?
Yeah, I mean, I think Cait got it exactly right. You have to ask yourself what the problem you're trying to solve is first, and whether it's a workflow question or we want to automate a particular story type, or bring in this data to create a trigger-based story. Those are the questions you need to ask first. Otherwise, you can find yourself sort of sprawling around, jumping around, trying to find your way in the dark. And I think this is actually a great question for smaller newsrooms as well, and those who may not be as far along as Lisa and Cait and Bloomberg are. But you have to figure out where the area that you think you're going to get the most impact out of, and you have to be able to track that impact. And so if you, as a newsroom, your strategy is, I really want to focus our energy on improving our workflow, that should be your priority. If you want to automate a repetitive task, that should be your priority, and really figure out how to take bite-sized chunks of this strategy before then pulling it all together, and eventually it becomes part of your everything that you do in a newsroom. But you really have to start in one place. Otherwise, yeah, you could end up with many hours wasted, and nothing's wasted. You always learn something from that. But you kicking yourself, thinking, oh man, like I wish I had known a little bit more of that. So.
Yeah, exactly. Lisa, what heartache has there been in your development life?
Yeah, well, it's so hard. And again, I would give the same kind of answer. I mean, I think that we learned over time to really be hyper-focused on the problems we were trying to solve and what was going to bring the most value to us. And I can't come up with an example of one particular project we pursued that was a spectacular failure and we shouldn't have gone down that rabbit hole. But I can think of a lot of time spent talking to startups and looking at demos and having conversations and kind of realizing, I should have known, like, that was really not time well spent. And just, almost mean, one of the things we've talked about at AP is almost like coming up with kind of the checklist for when we'll even, you know, have that first conversation with a startup, because I think we've learned so much about, you know, the need to keep that process very tight and focused. And I think, you know, at some point, maybe if we could talk a little bit more about this issue of how do we bring smaller and medium-sized news organizations into this world, and what's required to do that. Like, I think that's just a critical challenge and necessary, you know, for the industry as a whole, you know, particularly when you think about issues relating to news deserts and sustainability of the industry. I mean, I think I want for us to be really thinking about solving those challenges, which Emma highlighted in her answer.
Yeah. Just quickly, Cait, I wonder if you just pick up on that, because, you know, you have an impressive team and the FT is doing fantastic work, even as I understand it, you're even sort of, you know, selling the work you're doing to other organizations. How do you feel, though? Do you feel, I mean, when you look at what the Googles and the Facebooks or even, you know, big corporates, pharmaceutical companies, the amount of resource they have to implement AI, is that a question? Is it a matter of scale of resource, or is your focus on particular outcomes mean that there are other things that, you know, may be challenges for you?
So I think it really comes down to really about competition for attention. You know, my competition is not AP or Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. What we have to do is justify why people would spend time with the FT, and therefore we are competing with Facebook and Twitter and maybe less Snapchat for the FT audience, but, you know, one day that will happen. So, you know, when you think about that and where the advertising dollars are going, we are still ad funded at the FT as well as a highly successful subscription business. You know, the companies who we are competing with have much deeper pockets and much bigger teams and much more laser focus on, particularly when it comes to attention, you know, swallowing up as much attention as possible in order to make sure that they keep their advertising flywheels spinning. So this is not a level playing field by any stretch of the imagination. Do I think that the FT should be spending more than it's spending at the moment on my product and technology team? Maybe a little bit, but I think, you know, actually for me, it's about focus, and somebody mentioned the strategy word earlier, making sure that we have a very strong strategy that is going to help us grow now into the future. And I think it's one of the benefits of COVID and the pandemic is that it has forced us to rethink quickly, because certain things have declined faster, and we've seen disruption that we might have expected over 5 years in a 5-month time frame. So yes, I'd love to have the deep pockets of Spotify, Netflix, Amazon, Facebook, all of those things. Of course I would. But in the meantime, you know, we have to have a sustainable business. And we have 1 million paying subscribers, which is great, but it, you know, 1 million paying subscribers sustains a product and tech team of a certain size. So I think our size of team is right. We will grow a little bit next year in order to be able to double down on our subscription strategy. But it is my job and the job of my team and the job of the board of the FT to make sure that that money is invested as wisely as possible, and that we're honest with ourselves about what's working and what's not working, and stopping the stuff that isn't and doubling down on the stuff that is. All the good stuff that you would expect from any half decent product and tech team.
Right, really interesting. Mattia, so have we more questions?
We have so many more that I really don't know where to start. So since we started with Telegram before, I'll bring in one from YouTube, and it's Samia actually, who will be speaking at this festival tomorrow. Sorry, there's a mistake. Samia is asking, what kind of new skills are you looking for when hiring for these new AI roles in Newsroom for specific projects? We were starting having this conversation in the background before the call started, so I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. I'm
really interested in this as well, because I think it was interesting when we've seen previous waves of you know, technology, social media coming in and that sort of thing. There would often be the kind of hiring a 20-year-old just because they were familiar with it. We also saw some stunning successes where perhaps more experienced journalists would get the bug and would be able to adapt to those things. Answer the question for me, Emma.
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things that we did when we were starting to build out our strategy is to take journalists first and equip them, give them training and train them up and with the skills needed to sort of project manage engineers and be able to think linearly the way an engineer thinks. And I think it might be, may or may not be true, but I think it might be easier to do it in that direction because journalists are hardwired to be curious. Journalists are hardwired to ask questions, be skeptical, unsure of whether what's being presented to them is the truth or not, and then dig into it more. And that's exactly what you have to do with data, right? That's exactly what you have to do is look into it and say, okay, is what it thinks it's telling me what it's actually telling me, and so bringing that editorial skill set to the table first and foremost, and then growing in the more technical areas has actually been a pretty big benefit for us.
And do you struggle to get the right people, to hire people?
Well, there's definitely a recruiting.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry to interrupt. There's definitely a recruiting element when we do, when we are bringing in, and maybe Cait a little bit, the younger crowd that have more familiarity with the Snapchats of the world. But to that degree, a lot of younger journalists who are going through journalism school are already getting exposure to these different ways of storytelling and these different tools at their disposal, and are learning to code and are learning to set up, like I said earlier, bots and web scrapes and things like that. And so there's also a competitive element too, where you want to be able to bring the smartest people into your newsroom with the skills to be able to speak that language. You don't necessarily have to be able to produce a template to produce a fully automated story. It's okay, those capital J journalists that are coming out of school that want to be able to really dig in and break some big investigative story, they're going to want to be able to use all the skills or all the tools at their disposal. And there's an expectation as those people come into the industry that they're going to end up at places that can provide that support for them. So there's a literacy aspect to that as well.
Yeah. So Lisa, what do you think? I mean, we were joking before we started this. I was bragging about my shorthand and my typewriting skills gained many decades ago. I don't know if they're still relevant, but when you look for the skill sets from people coming, is it the job of J schools? Is it a question of you having to hire from different places, or is it a question of retooling the people you've got?
So I would say we've definitely had great experiences with bringing in people who had the data skills, who maybe, worked for nonprofits or, worked for outside of journalism, but in fields that sort of had some commonalities and have done really well at, bringing them into the culture. I worked on a project last year with students who were pursuing, they were in a dual degree program, journalism and computer science. And it was just absolutely the perfect blend where you had both just real technology acumen around building templates or programming or being able to find open source technology to experiment with things, but you also had, they had very direct experience with using those technologies for the purpose of creating story. And so, clearly not every journalist of the future needs to have a computer science degree as well as a journalism degree, but for certain roles, I think that's really great. But I'm really curious what Cait's answer to this is. Cait's doing a lot more hiring than I am on this.
So there's two things I would say, one of which is we have engineers working in the newsroom. So there's a team of engineers whose job it is to work with the newsroom and make sure that we are, that they have the agility and the speed to create the things that they need. That team of people, as you can imagine, have been working round the clock for the last 9 months or so. So if you've seen any of particularly the coronavirus data stuff that the FT has been doing, That's all being built in a complete collaboration between engineers from my team who are working with data journalists in the FT newsroom. And there is, some might work for me and some might work for Rula Halaf, who's the editor of the FT, but there is no separation between them in the newsroom or in their homes as it now is. So that has worked incredibly well, and you would find that the skills of those two groups of people do overlap. It's not these are the engineers and these are the journalists. There are journalists who can do you can wrangle data. People like John Byrne Murdoch, for example, who you might have seen sharing out coronavirus figures. So the skills are sort of coming closer together. I think the other thing I would say is there was a question I think in that about hiring. And how do you get people to choose to work for the Financial Times? I pay at market rate for my engineers and my product managers, but I can't and don't pay above market rate. Whereas the likes of Google and Facebook, who are also in London competing for engineers, are paying above market rate. And so you have to think about what is your employee brand. Quite frankly, why would you choose to work for the FT? And that comes down to mission and purpose. So there are people who choose to work at the FT who may not have been FT readers before, but they get and they understand and value the importance of a free press and the part it plays in our democracy and our society. And as we talked about disinformation earlier, it has never been more important. So there are people who will choose to work for the FT because they understand and get that holding powerful elites to account is slightly more important than getting someone's pizza to their door 5 minutes faster.
Yeah. I think that's fascinating, that sense of mission, because as you said yourself, Cait, that in the end people are kind of paying for the judgment and the values of news organizations, and in that sense trusting them to tell them accurate stuff about things they're interested in. And I don't know how far AI can run that itself. It's very much a human task. Lisa,
but the important thing there is thinking, how do you release your journalists from having to do the mundane tasks so that they can focus on the high value stuff, which is what people come to the FT for? And that's really the sweet spot of AI at the moment is, don't spend half an hour crafting a markets report. Spend 2 weeks doing investigative journalism into a thing that really, really matters and is going to change the lives of people and going to help them in the FT context be more successful at their work, which is one of the many reasons why people choose to use the FT.
Yeah, and I think you can see that. It's my subjective view, but I think the FT has got, the editorial has got more interesting, more sophisticated, more varied over time, and it's perhaps this technology is freeing them up from having to do those market reports. Lisa, I just wanted to turn to you quickly. We get quite a few questions. It may be that they're from people from perhaps smaller news organizations who are sort of asking, okay, it's all right for you three. You're not as big as Google, but you're all substantial news organizations. What's your sense of how people in small news organizations can capitalize on AI technologies, for example? How would they go about that?
Well, so I'm wondering if we have another hour to talk, because this topic is so dear to my heart. As much progress as we have made and as much excitement as there is legitimately around this, we still do not have a great actual playbook that we can say to a smaller news organization or, a niche news organization or whatever, like, hey, here's how you start thinking about this. And we need that. And we need that. And what I find, AP, because it's a distributor to other news organizations, I talk all the time to these news companies who want to know, hey, what are you doing exactly and how did you do it, so we can start thinking about how we would do it. A lot of news organizations still don't even have the basic understanding of where can this help me and how do I identify the problems that need solving. And it just seems like there's this massive amount of information and startups and tools and technologies, and how do you sift through all that and, you know, identify that one project? I've talked about this before a little bit. We did a project with Newsday Media Group in New York State last year where we were kind of trying to figure out what that playbook was. What are the foundational things that a smaller news organization needs to even be AI ready? There are many newsrooms out there that don't even have a developer working on these kinds of things, or if they do, they're 200% loaded with projects already. So anyway, somebody in the newsroom has to own it and be kind of responsible for looking out across the landscape and understanding the case studies, the examples that have gone before them. You know, really to actually execute the project, you do need some fundamental skills in the newsroom, you know, a developer, a digital technology team, you know, that person that's going to, you know, lead that. So there's that. And, you know, I just think that, I mean, what I think is actually needed is kind of a industry-wide sort of consulting desk, for lack of a better word, that can help news organizations get started in this and not be afraid of it. So that's why I always sing the praises of this collab so much. Yeah. Because I think that's really key to doing it.
Yeah, that's very sweet of you, Lisa. But it is, and obviously that's what we're trying in our small, humble way. We're trying to, you know, create the training courses, strategy courses, etc., and the collab as well, where we've had all these people from different size, different types of media organizations, and we've only just scraped the surface, really. And it may be that it's a bigger infrastructural kind of inequality that's going on, but I think there's lots of signs of hope. We've seen some brilliant work by smaller specialist news organizations, local news organizations, and also kind of intermediary media organizations who know about the tech and perhaps can facilitate other news organizations. What do you think about the smaller people, Emma?
Yeah, I think joining the more conversation we have around this topic, the better. And we were talking before this, before we all got online, about how encouraging it is that there are more and more voices in this space, and that there are more and more platforms for journalists and people in journalism to have this conversation. It's extremely valuable, I think, and providing a bit of clarity, I guess, and transparency around some of the struggles that the bigger companies have, so that if you are a smaller company, and like I said before, you know what the problem is you're trying to solve. You know, I would say a place like Quartz did a really good job as a medium, you know, small to medium sized news organization in having a desk that just played. You know, its entire job was to sort of play with things and see what worked. I mean, I remember at one point they had a light that would literally turn on in the corner, you know, that was automatically going to turn on in the newsroom when a certain market event or a certain economic event occurred. And that was sort of a cool beginning conversation around this stuff. I mean, you're not exactly going to build that if you're if that's, you know, that's not going to be part of your strategy necessarily, but sometimes creating a place to play or having conversations with the people at other news organizations about where they started, that can be a really interesting place to start.
What do you think, Cait? Do you think you can sort of replicate the kind of, you know, innovation and, as you said, focus in other areas, you know, like local news, for example?
It's a difficult question, and you know, I talk to other news organisations all the time, and as you said, the FT has been selling its expertise via FT strategies to other news organisations, partly funded by Google GNI as well. But I think the question is about focus, And if I was a local news organisation right now, I would be thinking about how I move to a subscription model as quickly as possible, because you have to secure your funding and you have to secure your funding into the future. And so those people who don't have a subscription model already are struggling, and they will continue to struggle. And the last 6 months has shown that how dangerous it is to depend on an ad-funded model for the future of news. And so whilst I would love to be able to say, yes, of course they can buy in some machine learning expertise and off they go, I don't actually think that's realistic, and I'm not entirely sure that that's the right area of focus. That said, there is a lot of subscription expertise that you can buy in that could and should be powered by AI to make sure that you're making the right offer to the right person. So I certainly wouldn't, the biggest advice I would give to people is don't try to build this stuff yourself. Where the market is providing, focus on where you differentiate, and where you will differentiate as a local news organisation or anything else is in your content, and not in necessarily how you acquire subscribers. So the barrier to entry in terms of introducing subscription models and using machine learning to improve your subscription models is reducing, and you can buy in that stuff from providers who will give it to you. But I wouldn't pretend that this is easy or straightforward in any way, shape or form.
Yeah. And I think that's probably quite a kind of realistic note to end on. 2020 has been such a tough year for everybody, personally, professionally, as you mentioned, having to work remotely, the strain that it's put on the business and the newsrooms, the strain it's put on the readers, frankly, but also it's been an incredible year where the coverage of the pandemic in particular and generally has been extraordinary from organisations like yourselves, and it's been fascinating to see the way that the AI technologies have in some way helped, as Cait said, helping the journalists to keep doing what perhaps they do best, which is being a bit creative, being a bit judgmental, being a bit innovative, and actually going out and reporting as human beings. It's a fascinating hour of conversation. I'm really grateful to you. I'm really impressed by what you're doing, and I hope that 2021 is a bit better in every kind of way for you all. So thank you very, very much. We'll end it here. The recording will be available online, and I hope very much that you'll stay in touch with us and our journalism AI efforts in the future. So thanks very, very much to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.